Toward the end of April of 1813, General Harrison had mostly finished having his men build Fort Meigs. There was still some finishing work needed to be done, but they got the batteries up, they got the walls up, they got the blockhouses established, and not a moment too soon, because General Proctor and Tecumseh were on the move down the western side of Lake Erie or overland out of Fort Detroit, coming to lay siege to Fort Meigs. And well, the first signs of trouble was actually going to be a scouting party a few miles downriver of Fort Meigs. I believe it was on April 26th. They come under fire. By April 30th, Harrison and his men can hear the shovels and axes cutting into the ground and the trees across the Maumee River on the north side. The British are digging in and establishing artillery batteries. They plan to shell Fort Meigs into smithereens. All right, we're back at Fort Meigs. Wait a minute. I thought the British abandoned this after the Northwest War. Why are we back here in 1813? Well, the ruins are still here. And actually, they're still here today in 2025. So if you ever want to actually see the site of Fort Meigs, it's preserved as part of a metro park for the city of Toledo. General Proctor, when he brings his British army and brings Tecumseh's Confederacy down here to lay siege to Fort Meigs, he's actually going to put his headquarters roughly in the vicinity of Fort Meigs. It's familiar ground. These defenses are a couple decades old, but those earthworks are probably still pronounced. So they're actually going to make camp within and surrounding this abandoned fort. So it gives an extension to this property's history. And kind of how the encampment of General Proctor is going to be laid out. You have his headquarters here at Fort Meigs, heading upriver, although we're technically going down if you think about it, heading up the Maumee River closer to Fort Meigs. You're going to have his main British artillery battery. And then by May 3rd, they're actually going to cross the Maumee River on the fort side, and they're actually going to construct another second battery to put some additional fire on Fort Meigs. It's about 300 yards away from the American fort. So that's kind of how the British and the natives are laid out. You got the headquarters here at Fort Meigs with a large encampment. On the north side of the river, you got the main British artillery battery. Eventually, you'll have a second British artillery battery on the south side of the river, looking right into Fort Meigs. And then, of course, you have the British and Native Americans surrounding the fort from the north, east, south, west, that whole nice circumference. All right, so we've actually moved across the Maumee River. We're now on the north side of the river. Fort Meigs is kind of covered up by the trees over here. And the reason I did that, I want to give you an understanding as to why the British set up the battery where they do. So if you pull back a little bit, we're now standing in the city of Maumee, Ohio, and up here is the First Presbyterian Church. And it was roughly in this location where the British put their main battery during the first siege of Fort Meigs. And the British are going to bring with them artillery pieces ranging from 12-pound field pieces all the way up to 24-pound guns. And keep in mind, one of the things Harrison had to give up when he decided to build Fort Meigs on the south side of the river was the high ground. He does that because he doesn't want his garrison to get caught off by the river in case of some flooding, or if the enemy just crossed the river and sit on the bluffs on the south side. So he actually gives up this high ground knowing that it's going to allow the enemy to have a good artillery platform. And that's exactly what the British do. They put an artillery battery right here. They could train all their guns right upon Fort Meigs. But don't worry, Harrison has a bit of a solution. So Harrison knew that Fort Meigs was about to come under a massive artillery bombardment. And to prepare for that, he ordered the entire garrison to begin making traverses. And those are all these earthen mounds you see up in the fort. Keep in mind, no barracks in May of 1813 here. This is all a canvas city. So what ends up happening is they start throwing up these traverses, and I think they were even upwards. Some of them went as high as like 20 feet when these were initially built. They were huge. Or maybe they're 20 foot long. I'm a little dazed. Yeah, Editor Chan, thank you for correcting me. So, but they had these tall earthen mounds, and they would kind of go in perpendicular lines to each other, and that's all designed to guard the encampments within the mounds, within the traverses, from enemy rounds that are coming from the north side of the Maumee River. And it actually worked decently amount. Don't be wrong. We had 1,700 artillery rounds pummeling this fort, but it was better than not having any protection. There are groundhogs in the traverses.
Groundhogs in the traverses.
There are groundhogs in the traverses. The British did say that Harrison had an army of groundhogs because they dug so much. There it is. There's the evidence. That's one of their burrows right there. By the morning of May 1st, 1813, Proctor had gathered a coalition of nearly 2,000 men in arms. It consisted of approximately 500 regulars from the 41st Foot, another 500 Canadian militia, and nearly 1,000 warriors organized by Tecumseh. Those warriors represented numerous tribes whose homes were now being defined by the United States' Old Northwest and British Upper Canada. Harrison had 1,100 men of the U.S. Army of the Northwest trapped inside the fort. The fort had multiple artillery pieces in place, but ammunition for the big guns was limited. Harrison would have to be selective on when his artillery crews responded to the enemy guns. But some 1,200 Kentucky militiamen under the command of General Green Clay were only a few days away. The question now was, would the defenses of Fort Meigs hold? Here's a breakdown of some of the different artillery rounds that were fired into or fired out of Fort Meigs. You got your solid shot, which would range from weighing 6 pounds, 12 pounds, all the way up to 24 pounds. Of course, this does not explode, contrary to what Hollywood will try to show you in movies. This is solid iron. It's designed to break through things, like wooden forts. Then you got your canister shot. This you would have to use up to a range of 200 yards, a pretty close range. It essentially it's a giant canister filled with what we would call a buckshot, essentially, when you fire your shotguns. Just very small projectiles that the concussion of this going off is going to send all those small projectiles flying out of the canister. And the canister itself will become shrapnel as well.
Yeah. And funnily enough, actually looks like a shotgun shell.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, it is literally a big shotgun shell when you really think about it.
Yeah.
It's just not cool and red and with a yellow bottom. It's black. Then you got grape shot, which they're very similar, and sometimes people use them interchangeably. There is a bit of a difference, and even I'm kind of telling myself this because I'm guilty of mixing them up. Canister shot's very small. Grape shot, same concept, but you're seeing much bigger projectiles. It's still smaller than a solid shot cannonball, but you're getting in there about, I'd probably say like half a dozen or so grape shot. And the reason it's called grape shot, well, it looks like grape that you'd pull out of the vineyard. And last but not least, we have howitzer shells, exploding shells. These are fired only out of howitzers, not cannons. This guy doesn't fire an exploding shell. You need a short-barreled gun, and the reason was initially you actually had to light the fuse. At this time period, you had to physically reach in there to light the fuse, and then you had to fire the gun off to get that ticking time bomb out of your barrel. You couldn't do that with a long barrel. And honestly, most artillery today is a form of a howitzer because now we have all sorts of ways we can automatically set the charge to ignite. But this is a 5.5-inch howitzer shell. And when these things hit their mark, if the fuse wasn't bad, that was always a problem this time period, you would get a massive explosion that can blow holes into a fort's wall, or if you hit an exposed powder magazine, bye-bye Fort Meigs. We would no longer be Perrysburg, Ohio, it would be Crater, Ohio. So picture that you're with Harrison's army. You're inside here the first few days of May of 1813. You got artillery fire coming in from the north. And although those traverses are going to protect you somewhat, it's not going to protect everybody. And as you see over here, we actually have a monument set up here in honor of Lieutenant John McCulloch of Ohio, who was an aide to General Harrison and was killed while conferring with the general, as well as Lieutenant Robert Walker of Pennsylvania, who was killed by Indians near Fort Miami. And it's said that both of them are buried somewhere in this general vicinity. One of our militiamen took his station on the embankment and gratuitously forewarned us of every shot. In this, he became so skillful that he could predict the destination of the ball. As soon as he saw the smoke issue from the muzzle of the gun, he would cry out, "Shot!" or "Bomb!" as the case might be. "Look out! Main battery! Blockhouse number 1. Now for the meat house. Goodbye if you will pass." The brave fellow continued to maintain this post despite the explanations of his friends, until one shot came which defied all his calculation. Silent, motionless, perplexed, he stood for a moment, and then he was swept into eternity. Here we have another monument for an individual that was killed as a result of the siege. This is dedicated to Major Amos Stoddard. Stoddard was wounded May 1st, 1813, on the opening day of the siege of Fort Meigs, would die on May 11th of tetanus, and was buried May 12th in front of the Grand Battery on the spot where he received a wound that caused his death. A native of Connecticut, Major Stoddard served in the American Revolution, practiced law in Massachusetts, and became a member of the Massachusetts legislature. He entered the U.S. Army in 1798 as a captain in the 2nd Regiment of Artillerists and Engineers. Commissioned the first civil and military commandant of Upper Louisiana, he received that territory from the French in 1804 in the name of the United States. He was promoted to the rank of major in 1807 and commanded the artillery at Fort Meigs when he was wounded. And actually, after the episode with General Leftwich, where he allowed everybody to do whatever they wanted, when Harrison got word of that, he kicked Leftwich out of command and put Stoddard in charge until Harrison was able to return in April of 1813.
Although casualties were suffered, Fort Meigs and its garrison held out 4 days against the British bombardment. But for as terrible of a noise those guns made, the British siege lines wrapped around the fort, they weren't airtight. But the night of May 4th, Harrison had received intelligence that Clay was only 5 miles upriver from the fort. The Major General devised a plan he hoped would break the siege. May the 5th would indeed see the most intense fighting, but did not go as Harrison had hoped.
On the early morning hours of May the 5th, 1813, General Clay of the Kentucky Militia is going to put Harrison's plan into action. They're going to come down the Maumee River in flatboats as close as they can without coming under fire by the British, and then they're going to split up. About 400 men will be personally led by General Clay on the south bank of the Maumee, and they have to fight their way through a line of native warriors and British soldiers that are laying siege to the fort on the western side. There will be some fighting, but they're able to largely run through the British and native positions and make their way up this hillside through these western gates and relieve the garrison here that's been besieged for several days now. However, things aren't going to be so clean on the north side of the Maumee River. Now, the region where Dudley's attack and, well, later defeat will ensue is now the community of Maumee City, Ohio. So it's a little hard for me to discern where exactly all these key positions were, but we did visit the marker at the Presbyterian Church where it said that the British battery was located, and that was Dudley's target. Dudley and the other 2 columns and Kentucky militiamen, they were supposed to come in kind of like a pincer. You'd have them on the flanks and behind the British battery. They were supposed to surround, spike the guns. It was supposed to be a bayonet charge, supposed to be very stealthy. However, it seems one of the Kentucky militia parties got the, well, as we would say sometimes, the dander up.
Boys got the dander up.
They seem to have saw some native warriors out in the woods that must have been covering the rear of the British battery, and instead of attacking the battery, they about face, started hooping and hollering, and gave chase at them. And of course, by that moment, Dudley's like, where did all these guys go? Then he starts hearing gunshots. Oh, crap, I gotta go rescue these guys. So Dudley, soon after taking the British battery, is going to move a bit farther away, maybe in this general area where the Maumee Library is today, where this historical marker is now standing. And unfortunately for Dudley, he finds that his entire Kentucky Militia Division is now surrounded by hundreds of native warriors. And what was initially an enthralling American victory that could have broken the siege now becomes the darkest moment for the U.S. military during the siege of Fort Meigs. This is Dudley's massacre. Ultimately, over 600 of the 800 Kentucky militiamen under Dudley's command would become casualties, killed, wounded, or captured. Dudley would be amongst the fatalities in this ensuing massacre. Only about 150 of the Kentucky militiamen are able to get out of the pocket that the natives have formed around them, get across the Maumee River, and get into the safety of Fort Meigs. Those that survived this defeat, well, they're going to be hauled off down to Fort Miami, where a very interesting event is about to transpire that'll kind of put a big fracture in the relationship between the British Empire and Tecumseh's Confederacy. So, after Dudley's defeat, the native warriors are going to bring those Kentucky militiamen that are captured here to Fort Meigs, and they're going to set up a gauntlet that they're going to force the survivors to run through. Keep in mind, some of these survivors are wounded. They're barely able to walk. And the gauntlet, you may have heard of it before in a lot of situations involving Native Americans involved in warfare. Essentially, you get two lines of people, put them on either sides with weapons in hand, and essentially they are beating these soldiers into a bloody pulp. Those that are the strongest may end up actually being taken into tribes, maybe being adopted or maybe being sent off to the British as prisoners of war. The weak are basically being killed off one by one. A similar situation had happened in January of 1813 at the River Raisin, that River Raisin massacre that happened to General Winchester's American Army and militia. So now we're having another repeat of this. And it was bad publicity for Tecumseh's Confederacy. And keep in mind, Tecumseh is very much a politician. In addition to being this war chief, he is also a politician. He's trying to politic for this Indian state to be made where the old Northwest Territory was, now Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and up in Michigan. He's trying to get the British to help him to create this buffer state. He does not need another massacre in his hands because it's only going to upset the United States of America further, lead to more violence on the frontier. So you get accounts of these survivors being brought into the ruins of the old fort, into the old parade ground. There's native warriors up in some of the surviving stockades, shooting down, taking pot shots. Tecumseh gets word of what's happening. He's going to ride in on a horse, and he's actually going to be starting to part the warriors from Dudley's men and basically chastising his warriors. You know, how dare you do this? Don't you realize what you're doing? You're only going to make the situation worse. We can't keep doing this. This is not the way we're going to win, secure our independence, secure our livelihood, secure our future from being wiped out, obliterated. He then demands, where's General Proctor? Because he sees there's some British officers just kind of watching this whole thing unfold. They don't want to intervene in any way. Maybe they're scared or they're apathetic to the whole situation. You know, those are their enemy being attacked. Why should they intervene? General Proctor eventually shows up, and there is a brutal exchange between these two leaders. Essentially, General Proctor tells Tecumseh that he is unable to control his men, his Indians. To which Tecumseh shouts, "Be gone! You are unfit to command. Go put on petticoats." It's very interesting to think that Fort Miami's lightning would strike twice. Historical gods just shoot down this lightning twice. You had the falling apart of the Northwest Confederacy with the British Empire in 1794 here. Now in 1813, it's happening again on the same site. Tecumseh and Proctor, Tecumseh's Confederacy, the British Empire, are falling apart in their alliance once again. Did not even know about the story, walking back to the car and realized this historical marker is double-sided. Private Patrick Russell, at this site on May 5, 1813, American prisoners of war that were captured at Dudley's defeat were exposed to an escalating level of physical violence by American Indian forces allied with Great Britain. The violence reached a level of deadly force as the prisoners were shot, tomahawked, and scalped. Private Russell of the 44th Regiment of Foot, sorry if I said that weird, 41st Regiment of Foot, attempted to intervene in the attack against the unarmed prisoners, but was shot and killed. Following the attack, approximately 40 Americans and Patrick Russell lay dead. For attempting to restrain the actions of others against unarmed prisoners, Russell made the supreme sacrifice. So Dudley's massacre, not the only action on May 5th. There's a lot going on May 5th, 1813 during the siege of Fort Meigs. And one of the events has actually occurred here on the eastern side of Fort Meigs. The British had set up a second artillery battery on May the 3rd, and they kind of had Fort Meigs in a cross artillery fire. And some point on May the 5th, Harrison decided he wanted to do something about it. So he's going to get a gentleman by the name of Joel Miller, who is an officer in one of the U.S. regular infantry regiments here. Miller's going to get together about a couple hundred picked men from the regular units and even some of the Kentucky militia. And their goal is to make a hasty sortie, rush outside of the eastern gate and swing right into the battery. And they are successful. They do reach the battery, which was about 300 yards east of me over the shoulder, roughly where Fort Meigs Union Cemetery is now located, unrelated to the battle. However, they will get kind of ensnared in with other British forces in that area. The U.S. forces actually suffer more casualties than the British, but they are successful in neutralizing the guns that were threatening the east side of Fort Meigs. They're actually to capture 42 prisoners from the British side and pull back into the safety of the walls of Fort Meigs. So this is the rough vicinity of where what becomes known as Miller's Charge will transpire out there.
With the loss of his second battery and support from Tecumseh unraveling, Proctor tried to cash out. Late on May the 5th, he sent an envoy to Harrison requesting the fort's surrender. This despite the fact the U.S. Armed Forces were still safe and secure within Fort Meigs. The two commanders continued communications until May 6, by which time Proctor had only secured prisoner exchanges. Proctor withheld any further shelling on account of word that a U.S. force had crossed Lake Ontario and was now occupying York, the provincial capital of Upper Canada. Fearing his supply chain would be cut off, Proctor quit the siege on Fort Meigs and made preparations to withdraw. On the morning of May 9th, the American sentries from the bluffs could observe gunboats downriver at the ruins of Fort Meigs loading up the British Army. The first siege of Fort Meigs was over. As soon as the enemy was out of sight, Harrison committed the garrison to repair work and burial details. The garrison inside the fort had suffered approximately 70 killed, with nearly 200 more wounded. That's not to speak of those who had fell outside the walls, particularly at Miller's Charge and Dudley's defeat. We interred between 45 and 50. I knew many of the men we found, and God avert my eyes from such another scene to the end of time. It was weeks before nature reasserted itself. Everything like mental power seemed to wither and die. Night after night did the horrid spectacle oppress me. The dead were interred in multiple mass graves just outside the stockade wall, making it important to remember that the historic site is one large war grave even today.
41st Regiment of Foot. Near this site during the War of 1812 stood the British encampment in the first siege of Fort Meigs. This marker honors the members of the 41st Regiment of Foot who died during the engagement. Killed in action on May 5th were Privates James Barclay, Richard Booth, William Carpmail, Samuel Cartledge, John Cox, Benjamin Norman, John Dyer, Edward Graves, and Patrick Russell. Private Edward Billing died of wounds from battle on May 6th, and Private John Chamberlain expired May 20th. So it's important to remember when we talk about the War of 1812, all the different sides involved. I mean, we're very American focused because, well, we're a little biased.
A little bit, maybe.
Yeah. But it's important to talk about the native warriors that are involved and the British that are involved in this, and especially because in Europe during the War of 1812, Great Britain really didn't care what was going on in North America, at least not in the initial phases. They were very preoccupied with a much more important matter, that being Napoleon and the wars going on because of that, because of his rise to power. So very little attention was being given, and at least initially, by the British Empire on this war in North America. The United States started it, and really all the British had to stop it were a couple odd regiments of foot that were stationed in North America, like the 41st Regiment. Man, I cannot say 41st today. 44th, that's all I want to keep saying. So these guys kind of, they're on the fringes of their homeland. They're on the fringes of their home country, and these guys are dying, some of them hundreds, if not thousands of miles away from home. Once Fort Meigs has been put back into a ready state, General Harrison is going to turn command of the garrison over to General Clay. Now, don't worry, this ain't going to be like when General Leftwich was in charge. People aren't going to tear the stockade down, start using it for firewood. People are not going to be hanging effigies on the storehouses of the quartermaster. This time around, some say that General Clay was actually too much of a disciplinarian, but nevertheless, he ran a very tight ship throughout July of 1813. And it's a good thing because in July of 1813, he is going to be in charge of the fort when it's under attack for a second time. So yeah, we had said that Tecumseh and Proctor were starting to quibble amongst themselves after the first siege. Yeah, it didn't get any better. They went back up the Detroit River, up to Detroit, and I should also mention, the British are not just at Detroit, they also have defenses at Fort Malden across the Detroit River, which is now known as Amherstburg, and it's there where Commodore Barclay and the Royal Navy Fleet for Lake Erie is being established. And while Proctor throughout June and July has to give up a lot of his heavy artillery to Barclay so they can fit guns on these gunboats that Barclay is expected to command on the lake. However, Tecumseh is gathering more and more warriors to his cause. Himself, other native leaders like Roundhead, and British Indian agents are going all throughout North America. They're bringing thousands of warriors to support Tecumseh. And while Proctor's put now in a bind, he needs to do something with these warriors before they get angry with him. But on the other hand, he needs to defend Fort Malden, Amherstburg, Detroit, that whole area from a potential American attack by Commodore Perry and his American fleet. Not to mention that General Harrison has the bulk of the U.S. Army in the Northwest gathering on the banks of Lake Erie at the mouths of the Portage and Sandusky rivers, waiting to be ferried across to invade Upper Canada. Tecumseh is actually going to be the one who gets put really in charge of the strategy for the British on Lake Erie in July of 1813. And he sets his sights on Fort Meigs again. He wants to do what Proctor could not do. So, in late July, Tecumseh and thousands of his warriors are going to descend down Lake Erie. They're being supported by a few hundred British regulars commanded by General Proctor. And the siege lines start developing on July 21st, 1813, basically just like the last time. But the big difference is the lack of British artillery. Now, they had a few light guns, but those heavy guns, they're on Barclay's ships. And another thing to point out, when Proctor retreated the last time, he left in such a haste, he had left caches of munitions in his camps north of Fort Meigs, which the American garrison confiscated, and it solved their issue of a munition shortage. Remember the last time they can only use the guns sparingly? Well, this time Fort Meigs' artillery is fully operational. The siege begins on July 21st, 1813, and it's a bit different from the last time. No big booms, mainly small arms fire. The Native Americans are in Tecumseh's command. They're trying to draw the Americans out into an ambush. So they're hooping and hollering, they're throwing insults at the American garrison, they're taking carefully chosen shots at any head that pokes beyond the stockade wall. But Clay does not budge. He is not coming out of the garrison. He knows he's safer inside the walls with his heavy guns, and he'll just wait it out. And by July 26, Tecumseh has come together with a strategy that'll hopefully force Clay's hand. So Tecumseh gets all of his warriors together, and they get all Proctor's soldiers together, and in the woods south of Fort Meigs, they stage a sham battle. So imagine hundreds of muskets going off, some light field pieces firing, hooping and hollering, maybe some fake cries for help for Clay, because they're trying to make it seem that a relief party for the American fort has just been ambushed, and that's going to force Clay to come out into the forest to relieve them, only to them themselves be ambushed by Tecumseh. Surely this plan will work. Clay knew Harrison was preoccupied with building up the army in the Northwest, prepping it to cross Lake Erie. He was not coming back to Fort Meigs anytime soon, and Clay had all the resources to hold out for some time. Clay knew there was no American relief party under attack that day. He does not come out of the fort, and to make matters worse for the British and the natives, it starts pouring rain late afternoon on July 26. What is Proctor and Tecumseh to do now? Proctor knows he needs to gain some victories, some type of success out of having all of these native warriors amassed, because they're not staying around long. Some of them have traveled weeks, and they want to get a quick victory, get some plunder, and get back home. So to satisfy Tecumseh's Confederacy, Proctor breaks off the siege of Fort Meigs, and he pivots about 30 miles to the southeast to Fort Stevenson. It's a much smaller American fort than Fort Meigs. It's just been built a few weeks earlier. It only has about 160 American soldiers guarding it, so in theory, Proctor and Tecumseh should be able to overwhelm it. The Battle of Fort Stevenson is a complete mess for Proctor. He is throwing his soldiers very haphazardly at the fort's walls, and the Americans are able to outmaneuver him by moving the one cannon they have to the different walls to drive back Tecumseh's warriors, so drive back Proctor's men. It just turns into a mess, and it ain't worth Proctor investing any longer. He breaks off the attack not too long later, and he begins falling back toward Fort Detroit, infuriating Tecumseh and many members of his Confederacy who did not get a single victory out of this entire summer being down here on Lake Erie in 1813. After the U.S. naval victory at the Battle of Lake Erie, General Harrison moved his forces out of Ohio, crossed Lake Erie, and chased Proctor and Tecumseh down till the Battle of the Thames in what was then Upper Canada, now Ontario. General Harrison drove Proctor off the battlefield pretty quickly, and ultimately the battle led to the death of Tecumseh and the collapse of his native confederacy. Fort Meigs was downsized and really went to a more standard star fort design. The two blockhouses you see here and this curtain wall actually became incorporated as part of the smaller second fort. And that was commanded by a guy by the name of Duncan MacArthur, who, very interestingly, they actually have his writing desk on display down in the museum. Fort Meigs would remain in operation in a small scale till early 1815 when, after the Treaty of Ghent was signed and agreed upon, the War of 1812 was ended and everything went back to status quo. And very quickly Fort Meigs, was consumed by landowners moving into new landowners moving into the region. Settlers tore all the walls down, used the logs for all sorts of stuff, and there was nothing really left but some earthen ruins of the traverses. However, beginning in the early 20th century, there was a push to commemorate the importance of this site, and eventually a giant monument was dedicated here. This was dedicated in 1909, I believe. I could be highly mistaken. My brain is fried. That's why we have Editor Chan at home, correcting me at all times. It says 1908, actually. My apologies. But yeah, the state of Ohio had this massive obelisk dedicated on the grounds of Fort Meigs. I mean, it's huge. It's huge. And the actual dedication ceremony when it happened here was attended by members of the Grand Army of the Republic, American Civil War veterans, because they were having a reunion in nearby Toledo at the time. So they were really the main honor guard for the dedication. So there's a Civil War connection here to Fort Meigs. And actually, if you think about it, this obelisk looks very similar to some monuments you would find on American Civil War battlefields, including Gettysburg. We're not going to go in detail on the timeline because that's really what the purpose of this video is, to tell you the timeline and the history, the story of Fort Meigs. But we'll go down quickly a little bit. February is when they begin building the fort here. Of course, William Henry Harrison is the commander of the U.S. Army of the Northwest. This fort is being built to reorganize the army after the River Raisin massacre and get ready to go back into Michigan territory, recapture Fort Detroit, and if possible, invade Canada and drive the British out of Upper Canada. Fort's finished at the end of April, and it's also in late April that General Henry Proctor of the British Army, alongside Shawnee Chief Tecumseh with his confederacy of various native tribes, they're going to come up the Maumee River. They're coming down from Fort Detroit. They're going to come up the Maumee River, and they're going to lay siege. The first of two siege of Fort Meigs. This is the one where you're going to hear all about the artillery barrages that happened and all the big fighting on May 5th, like Dudley's massacre. And very interesting, I love that they use comics. They use these comic strips to really describe the first major siege, showing some of the actions that were happening. Here's the comic version of Dudley's massacre. Here's comic Harrison shouting at his men, "Get back over here! Don't get massacred!" And then they got massacred. What a turnaround.
Comedic timing.
Yeah, comedic timing there.
Yeah.
But yeah, we're geeking out over how Fort Meigs Museum does their historical interpretation.
These exhibits, I'm assuming, have been here for a while. They are some of the most engaging exhibits, especially for younger kids, I think, that I've seen in a long time. And look, not an iPad in sight.
No, you don't need an iPad. You don't need a touchscreen. You people know my rant about I want an exhibit in a visitor center at a museum where you have to physically touch grass. This is the equivalent of my physical touching grass exhibit. Dioramas, nice comic strips, things you can lift up, hold on to. You don't need everything to be on a touchscreen.
Yeah, I don't want to go to your museum and look at items in your collection through a screen. I want to look at the items in your collection in a case.
Yes.
Yeah.
Just one moment to appreciate the scale of what is here. Originally built in 1813, reconstructed in the early 1970s, and then re-reconstructed in 2003. 10 acres. Some say it's the largest wooden stockade fort still in exhibit in North America. Yeah, I could see why. It's a lot to take in. Well, that's gonna wrap up our day here at Fort Meigs outside of Perrysburg, Ohio. A massive fort from the War of 1812. Well, it's been reconstructed to look as it did during the conflict. Me and a humble collector had an awesome time here. So my hat's being tipped to the staff here at Fort Meigs Museum. You do a wonderful job interpreting the events of War of 1812 at this site, because not a lot of people know about the War of 1812, and it should be a conflict talked about more often because of the impact it has not just on the United States of America, but the British Empire and the Native American tribes that live in North America. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit the like button down below. If you want to follow us on future adventures, consider subscribing here to the channel, because if you subscribe to the channel, make sure to run away from the cicadas. Gosh darn it. It sounds like an episode of Evangelion out here. Jeez. Yeah, consider subscribing here to the channel. I promise you, cicadas will not follow you when you subscribe. And if you want to go the extra mile supporting us, you can go to our Ko-fi page. Links in the description below. And if for a small monthly fee, you can join the Garrison. It's our monthly membership program, which gives you behind-the-scenes access to select scripts, early access to select videos, and I always try to build new bonuses as time passes on. So thank you to the members of the Garrison. Thank you for watching. And before we leave, I just want to mention, you may want to be watching for the next episode. We were talking about the battles that happen here at Fort Meigs impact the fighting that'll happen on the water of Lake Erie. Next episode of Retracing History, we're going out as close as we can get to where that famous naval action occurred September 10th, 1813. So stick around.